Wonderful. Yes, the mic seems to be working. Brilliant. If we could bring up the primer slides, that would be awesome. Well, thank you all again for joining us here today. It's a really exciting day to explore this topic. And, thinking back to just about a year ago when Ben and I released our paper, really the title of it was Theory to Practice. And this represents a really excellent opportunity to shift the discussion again from the academic theory that we're good at here at Oxford into real-world practice. And I just want to acknowledge all of those in the audience here today. You've been carefully curated to ensure a dynamic between academics, policymakers, corporate practice, and everything in between. And so we're really hoping that and intend for that to inspire some really great conversations related to practice. Now, we also acknowledge carbon removal budgeting is a new concept, and so we wanted to start today with a bit of a primer on what it is. And so this is unpacking a little bit about what we cover in the paper, but also just a chance to refresh that or to introduce it if you're not so familiar. So a carbon removal budget is a tool. As Ben said, it's a tool that can be used in a number of different contexts, and ultimately in the paper we put forward the framework. Now, this framework can be utilized in a number of different ways, but critically it's important because we need to start having these conversations about how to develop carbon removal potential, allocate it, and ensure that that's done so equitably and sustainably. And this is building on a lot of work from colleagues here as well as at other institutions to really think through the kind of carbon removal techniques that we have, and again, how these can scale and develop. Carbon removal still remains, and this is lessening, but a poorly understood resource in terms of, we all acknowledge the need for net zero, but often the net in that discussion gets left. As Ben said, it's often implicit, indeed, in kind of net zero targets, whether that's set at the domestic level or even when we're considering Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement and the need to balance sinks and sources there. But it's an incredibly valuable resource, and it is that because it provides that net in net zero, but it's also the only way that we can shift not only from net zero, but critically also to a net negative state in future and ultimately reduce temperature. It's also a resource that we know we do not have enough of, and colleague Dr. Steve Smith has done some excellent work kind of illustrating the CDR gap that we have today. And this is why it's critical, because it's not that we can go out tomorrow and scale it all. We need to carefully plan it. We need to ensure that comparative advantages across geographies are unlocked, and equally that the carbon removal that we're developing actually meets the needs to stabilize global temperatures. And this requires careful planning and execution, which is often lacking today. At the same time, as I mentioned, the opportunity to undertake carbon removal, and in many respects, which will ultimately develop into a brand new industry, is not distributed equally, but equally there's a number of different pathways that are available, and we'll unpack a little bit about that further. But we also know there's an obligation to remove the carbon that we're producing, and we're getting more and more analysis in terms of what our residual emissions look like, and again, whose responsibility those are to clean up. But at the same time, as we're needing to increase the supply of global carbon removal, we need to ensure that equitable distribution is at the core of it. And this is both, again, in terms of the opportunity to develop carbon removal as a resource, but equally in terms of who gets to use what. So a little bit of context. As we mentioned, obviously the carbon removal budget has its parallel in carbon budgeting. And how that came about is really this recognition of the need to stabilize global temperatures, and the way to do so being to manage the cumulative amount of CO2 that we're putting up into the atmosphere. One way to do that is reducing emissions, but the other way to do that is scaling removals on a commensurate timescale. We also know there's an array of different carbon removal pathways that we have available. So whether that is more nature-based techniques such as afforestation, reforestation, planting mangroves, or developing seagrasses and whatnot, all the way through to the novel technologies. And these can include things like biochar, as well as direct air capture, and many other forms as well. And what's complicated here, and why it's great to have B0 here as partners of the event, is that quality can really matter here. And it particularly matters, again, if our goal is stabilizing global temperatures, because these different carbon removal pathways do play different roles. And one of the debates that we can get into today is, again, how the concept of carbon removal budgeting can sit alongside and complement kind of domains such as the like-for-like approach that is often discussed as well today. But equally, we know, just as carbon removal budgets are different in their composition, they're also very much dependent on the price, as well as the technological readiness of the different solutions too. And so all of these kind of factors matter, as well as the co-benefits and risks that they offer. And again, that's where equity comes into play. But as we know, the kind of trite saying that if we're not measuring it, we can't manage it. This is why carbon removal budgeting is so critical, because until we actually can appreciate the likely deficit that most institutions are in, whether you are at a corporate, a financial institution, or right the way up to a national government that has a net zero target, we need to start grasping the specific shortfalls that we have in order to start managing that. And managing that, again, looks like decreasing your emissions in terms of your reliance on the carbon removal budget, and doing everything you can to scale that carbon removal as well. So we define the carbon removal budget as the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide available to contribute to the realization of global temperature goals. And this matters because it depends which global temperature goal we're talking about. Obviously, within the Paris Agreement, there is a range. We say well below 2 degrees. We know there's a number of different pathways to help reach that. And that matters in terms of, again, the kind of emissions that we're putting out there, as well as the potential implications for removals as well. And so stylistically, this looks like this. And we'll unpack a little bit about what we mean by available removal, but it's critical just to say that it's not sufficient to kind of map the techno-economic potential of removal. We need to ensure that it's actually accessible in terms of its cost as well as its distribution, and ultimately start to manage it as a scarce and yet valuable resource. So, as Ben said, carbon removal budgeting is dynamic, and so this is one of the key kind of themes today, and I'm calling it the kind of first principles here. So we need to understand the nuanced interplay between supply and demand pressures. So supply, again, depends on what's physically available. This could be, for instance, access to geological storage for some of the pathways. It could be access to temperate rainforests when you're scaling afforestation and reforestation activities. But it equally has to be financially viable. And so again, we know that novel carbon removal can be up to 100 times more expensive than conventional carbon credits. And so we need to ensure that we have available funds and that we're serious about planning to allocate adequate financial resourcing in order to realize that potential. But equally, demand matters. And so again, we need to be ensuring we're taking all steps following the mitigation hierarchy to reduce our emissions, because that is principally a lot easier than actually addressing a large carbon removal budget deficit. The second first principle that I wanted to just walk through is that it's really a product of constraints. And so we can see that CDR pathways in and of themselves have constraints, and that is related to, again, the different inputs that they require, as well as even different socio-cultural readiness and acceptability of certain pathways. And here in the UK, we've seen some developments in ocean carbon removal that have prompted local backlash. And so we need to be thinking about the full range of pathways and, again, how they are affected by constraints. We also can think about it temporally, and we had some questions earlier today about is it an annual carbon removal budget, is it cumulative? And the answer is it can be both. And again, depending on the need for carbon removal budgeting, the different lenses temporally can offer different insights. And again, it can be tailored to the use case for your planning. Financially is obviously a really key constraint because we know willingness to pay on the voluntary side can vary, and we've seen some great steps in that regard. But equally, when we start thinking about the future integration into compliance schemes, we start to enter a new domain also of, again, tying it very closely back to marginal abatement cost curves and whatnot, but again, a product of a constraint. And equally, ambition. So we also see this range between the voluntary measures that actors are undertaking, carbon removal investments and developments in, but we're also knowing that that is signaling to change. And we are grateful for the opportunity to unpack some of those themes today, especially in light of announcements at the UK, EU levels. So we'll really be getting to grips with that and what that means. Some applications as well I wanted to flag. So in the paper we walk through three, the first being under the Paris Agreement itself. So we've seen a lot of discussions around how different levers of the Paris Agreement will start to be operationalized, including Article 6. But really, when we're thinking about how we reach the Article 4.1 balance of sinks and sources, carbon removal budgeting could be a key tool in order to help make that happen. Equally, domestically, governments have the potential to develop their own carbon removal budgets and help those inform their investment decisions. And we see this domestically in the UK when we set our kind of domestic carbon budgets. Equally, setting a domestic carbon removal budget can help identify key risks and dependencies and again illustrate where critical investment and R&D is needed. But we can also downscale it to the level of corporations and financiers, and we'll unpack that later in parallel session B, the ways in which commercial applications of carbon removal budgeting can come about, and this is both on the supply and demand side. Just wanted to flag about how we can conceptualize such a carbon removal budget, and really to illustrate that there is three kind of key states you could find a carbon removal budget in. The first, and much more common, is a carbon removal deficit. And so this is where your demand you're placing on the global carbon budget is actually at odds with the level of carbon removal budget supply that you have secured. If everything is balanced, you would have a state of a neutral carbon removal budget. But equally, if you have an annual carbon removal budget surplus, you're actually starting to contribute again, further mitigation and help ultimately shift to a state of net negative as opposed to just net zero. But these different states, in broad terms, are important to kind of understand because, again, this can help signal where an actor is in terms of their ambition and also their delivery on their ambitions. In the paper, we sized the global carbon removal budget from 2025 to 2100. And we did so to kind of test this theory about how it applies in practice. And what we did is look at bottom-up carbon removal supply estimates. We used the benchmark of $100 to inform the kind of financial viability. And we also adjusted it to reflect different technological readiness levels. This yielded, as many would appreciate in the room, a big range. And this is because it also spotlights the need for further granular data and analysis to develop over time. We also looked at a number of different pathways, but as we'll unpack, it's possible, again, to conceptualize a carbon removal budget for any given pathway. And this can be especially useful when mapping the prospects for the development of a given pathway. But we can also compare the bottom-up supply to the top-down demand. And this is where the critical link back to the global temperature goals comes into play, because it really does matter what you're aiming to achieve. And this matters because in the forecasting and the kind of IPCC scenario development, that informs what kind of residual emissions we have, their biogenic or geologic nature, and the timing of removals as well in terms of helping to realize a specific temperature outcome. And again, we can find a very wide range. And so we need to appreciate and understand, and tying back to that, the dynamic nature of carbon removal budgeting, that it is an exercise that can and should be performed at regular intervals as our understanding of the data and the inputs becomes sharper and sharper over time. We had some results. Again, you can read through these all in our paper. I won't spend time unpacking them today on a Thursday morning, but just to say again that it's critical that we, again, have in mind what kind of temperature outcome we're reaching, because this does affect the temporal nature of that balance between carbon removal supply and demand over time. And we can also start to conceptualize its relationship to the carbon budget. It's a theme that we'll touch on today, not only in terms of its direct implications or applications to the carbon removal budget, but equally in terms of what lessons can we learn from how the carbon budget developed over time and its role that it's played, but equally the ways in which its uptake has been limited or potentially politically controversial and sensitive at times. Now, there's a number of implications of carbon removal budgeting, and we get the chance today to explore many of those, but I just wanted to flag a few here today. So again, coming back to the importance of quality. It's not just enough to kind of tot up all the carbon removal possibilities in the world, because we know carbon removal varies greatly in terms of its permanence, in terms of the MRV quality that it could bring about, in terms of its additionality, and in terms of the co-benefits and risks. And again, coming back to carbon removal is place-based ultimately, and it's situated within communities, and we'll get to hear some insights from across the world, from Bolivia to India, and many different jurisdictions about what this could look like. We also, again, need to think about their constraints, so these could be geological, environmental, and again, coming back to the fact that these are situated within communities, that sociocultural lens also greatly matters. We can also, though, think through different levers to help accelerate carbon removal budgeting and its applications, and we, again, walk through some of these in the paper, but we can think through catalytic funding models and their role. We can think through communities of practice and their role in helping steward and develop carbon removal potentials. But equally, it's not just enough to kind of grow the carbon removal budget, even doing so sustainably. It matters, again, how that potential is allocated. And we really want to spotlight that importance of equity. In the paper, we identify some utilization pathways. I guess the default that we are experiencing now is first come, first served. But again, if we start to take carbon removal planning more seriously, we can start to think more proactively about not only what's fair, but also what can best scale the technologies to. And so, one tension today that we'll be exploring is, again, how we grow that and do so in a way that is equitable. So in summary, carbon removal budgeting can be a powerful tool to help us really plan the net and net zero, but more critically, it's also a tool that we can start to develop, especially as is raised throughout some of the presentations today, but equally in some of the earlier conversations around the topic. As we're approaching the finite carbon budget, we do need to start thinking about what is next. And the sooner we start to plan, the better we can start to manage how we develop that. But as again, it has a number of implications and applications within the real world, and we'll explore some of those today, both for the corporate level, but equally right up to nationally and even internationally, again, coming back to the fact that nearly all countries in the world have set a target to balance global sinks and sources. But equally, we know, again, that we need to stop placing so much demand on carbon removal, and that ultimately it still matters most, especially at this critical juncture pre-2030, to do all we can to mitigate global emissions. But again, even the notion of carbon removal budgeting can be relatively controversial for this very issue that people could say doesn't lead to mitigation deterrence. And so through all of these different components, I wanted to offer some provocations for the rest of the day and for as well thoughts beyond the symposium, because as Ben said, we very much see this as the start of a beginning of research collaboration and conversations about how to shift this into practice. And so again, how do we ensure that carbon removal budgeting can be used as a tool to accelerate mitigation rather than deter it? And again, how do we address that kind of moral hazard consideration that when you start to input some of these numbers into carbon removal budgets, again, what does this mean, and can it be used in a credible way that doesn't seem to suggest that we can address emissions that could be reduced now at a later date through carbon removal? Also, we can think about how can the carbon removal budget be reconciled with other emerging paradigms that we're seeing in the research. So, the like-for-like principle I mentioned, but equally the notion of carbon take-back obligations, which we'll be hearing from Dr. Alice Evett about shortly. It's really critical that we not only think about how to develop the tool in and of itself, but how it fits in within the broader landscape of innovations in climate research. Equally, how do we draw attention to the carbon removal budget deficit? As I mentioned, globally, we know we are in one, and that will only continue to grow throughout the century. So how do we ensure that this is known amongst policymakers? But more than that, how do we actually take proactive steps to reduce this deficit and actually apply the carbon removal budget concept to inform active investment decisions and other matters like that? Equally, it's important, again, because of the wide range of inputs needed to develop a carbon removal budget, that we ensure methodological rigor in developments related to carbon removal budgeting, and again, use it to spotlight where the data needs to be improved. So where our estimates of, say, supply at 2030, 2040, 2050 at a range of price levels actually needs to be sharper so that we can have more confidence in our carbon removal budgeting. And equally, it's important to consider what is the alternative right now. I mean, what we can see today is that often carbon removal needs are implicit in net zero targets. But what does it mean to explore alternatives? And again, what can we learn from how other concepts have evolved from academia to practice in terms of that process of action? And again, thinking through the broader ecosystem of ideas in terms of how do they complement and conflict. And given that this is Oxford here today, I'm really hoping that this will be the stage for healthy debate and discussion, because for an academic concept like this to get cut through, we need to ensure that it's clear, that it has this clarity, but equally that it is subject to and able to be debated and really well understood, and help carve out the path forward through discussions like that. So that brings me to the end of this primer. Again, we'll have opportunities later through the Q&A sections, as well as obviously the many opportunities for networking to unpack this further in conversation. But I'd like to now kick us off with our plenary session 1 and welcome Dr. Alice Evatt and Jacopo Bencini to the stage. Thank you.